Welcome, everyone. My name is Corinne, and I will be your moderator this evening. I am excited to welcome Lee Tessler from Cirrus Consulting Group for 5 tips to negotiate what you thought was non-negotiable. In this session, Lee will cover the basics of negotiation and taking control of 2023. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to go over some housekeeping. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A section and we will answer those questions live at the end. And also CE is available for this webinar if you're watching it live. All right, Lee, welcome. I will pass it on over to you now.
Thank you, Corinne. Thank you everyone for joining tonight. We're looking forward to a very beneficial hour, as Corinne said, just talking about 5 tips to negotiate and really just talking about how we can improve your leverage and production as a dental tenant. You should see some polls come on your screen. There you go. So while we're waiting for a few more people to join, if you wouldn't mind, just take a second to just fill out the intro poll. It just kind of gives me a good idea of where you're at, what sort of best describes your situation. In terms of what plans you have for growth, if you have a dental office lease, when does that expire, etc., or maybe you plan to start a practice, and if you're interested in a 15-minute consultation complimentary. So whilst everybody's just take a minute to fill that in, see a few more people joining. And then we will get started in very shortly. Okay, so purpose of today or tonight's webinar, as I said, basics of negotiation, 5 tips to negotiate the non-negotiable. We're going to look at sort of optimizing your main revenue stream. As you realize, the occupancy cost is the second biggest hit in your overhead, and looking at how we can get some leverage back, how working with dental specific companies will benefit your practice. We'll also look at some of the technical provisions within a lease, some of the red flags that we see, and some of the tricks and tips that the landlords will play with the dental tenant. So firstly, there are 3 numbers for you on the screen: 85, 54, and 80. Now, what do these 3 numbers mean? Good question. So firstly, 85% of dentists have a lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent for their practice. And 80% have a lease that's structured in a way that will give the landlord 50% rights of the proceeds of sale when the practice is sold. Pretty staggering kind of number when you look at it like that. So I think it's obviously important to understand a little bit about Cirrus and who we are and how we've been representing the dental community for over 25 years now. So we were founded by dentists, for dentists, as I said, over 25 years ago, really for the reason that landlords were taking advantage of the dental and healthcare tenant. As you know, it's an expensive business to enter into and can be very profitable when it comes to transitioning. So since inception, we've negotiated over 12,000 dental and medical office leases. I would say around 75% is specific to dental. We do other healthcare practitioners, veterinarians, general practitioners, rheumatologists, chiropodists, health and wellness. We really do work with healthcare professionals nationwide. And what makes us unique is we do everything in-house. So we have an in-house legal team comprised of real estate attorneys, some with a background in healthcare. We have consultants, which I'm part of, the team. We've also actually hired some of our lease negotiators from the landlord side, the dark side, as we say. And as you know, tonight's course is a CE accredited continuing education course. So we and I deliver numerous amount of lectures across the country, educating healthcare professionals on the business side of dentistry. And we attend the Greater New York Dental Meeting, the Yankee, the Pacific, the California. We really do work with dentists nationwide. So let's look at some of the sort of top negotiating tips for the non-negotiable. One of the questions I always like to ask at my seminars or webinars, hopefully we'll be able to do more in person to get a gauge from the room, but I do always ask, what is a lease? What does a lease mean to you? Now, from our perspective, really what it is it's a check, and it's one of the biggest checks that you will write in your professional career. If we take an average square foot of around 2,000 square foot, and if we look at, say, an average base rent of $5,000 a month, just an average number, most dentists will statistically stay in their practice for at least 22 years, and that is purely statistical number there. Essentially, the reason is, as we have mentioned and as we will continue to talk about, it's a very expensive business to enter into, and it's not somewhere where you want to be moving every year or overnight when you've spent a lot of money on plumbing and equipment, etc. So even if we take an average $5,000 rental payment per month, just the base rent, that's $60,000 per annum. Now, over 10 years, we're looking at $600,000 of occupancy costs, and 20 years, 1.2 million. Now, that's not taking into account any annual escalations, just rental escalations in line with inflation, even at sort of 3% on average, even though the inflation has increased nearer to sort of 6-7% in the last sort of 6 months. But even if we're not even including any annual incremental increases, we're not including operating costs, triple net, tax, maintenance, insurance, you're looking at $1.2 million over that period. Now, the reason I stress that, because it's extremely important to know how valuable you are as a tenant, and what sort of leverage you provide coming to the table, and having your practice set up at a certain location from a landlord perspective. And exactly why the office lease is so important, because your office location is the foundation of your practice. If you drove tomorrow and got your Starbucks or whatever your preferred beverage was on the way to work, and you turned up to the office and there was a letter or notice to say that you've got 60 days and you are being relocated, or the building's being demolished, what would you do? It is an extremely expensive cost to build out a new practice. You're looking at anywhere from $250, $300 per square foot to build out a new practice. So that is why the lease is so vital, and it's really important to ensure, as we will sort of touch on as we go on tonight, why it's so important that you protect that asset and you're in control of the location, because it's expensive to move. In some cases, you may have outgrown the practice and you may want to move, and it's not to say that you can't, but you don't want to be forced to. You want to move when you can, not when you have to. And then the practice sell. Really, the lease can have a huge impact on whether you can essentially transfer the lease and sell your practice, right? The landlord can have full control on whether or not he gives the green light to transfer the lease. Now, again, the reason why I'm stressing it's so important is, yes, you may say, well, okay, well, if I have a problem, I can sell my charts and goodwill and equipment. Yes, there is some value in your equipment, and obviously there's a lot of value in your charts, but if someone is actually wants to pay for that, and then they have to take your charts and equipment and build out somewhere else, then you're looking at, like I said, you're looking at another $500,000, $1 million of something that's going to cost to build out, which is going to reduce the value of your practice. So what should the office lease do for you? If you had a magic wand and you could have anything you want in the lease, what should it do for you? So firstly, it should provide fair and affordable financial terms. What we mean by that is rent. We pay for a lot of proprietary data to have a look at the current and rental rates and vacancy rates in the area. And we want to make sure that the first thing you're doing is paying your rents are in line with fair market value. And if there is any rent escalations, again, is that in line with current and inflation? Landlords at the moment have been used to an average, probably an increase of sort of no more than 3% per annum. Obviously, we've seen a sharp rise in inflation in the last year. And landlords, if they can take advantage of a 6 or 7% increase, then they're gonna do that. What you don't want to be doing is because of inflation that's slightly higher at the moment, you don't want your increases to be 7%, year on year for the next 10 years. So that's extremely important. We want long-term stability and security. So again, what do I mean by that? We want to ensure that we have enough term and options so that we actually have control of the location and of the building. So if you're putting a lot of money into a new space, we normally recommend a 10-year term with 2 5-year options. And just to make sure that you have that control. You don't want to get to a position where you're running out of term and you're running out of options, and you get to sort of the last 5 years and then there's no more term, because again, you're just losing a little bit more leverage. We want to minimize risk and exposure. So minimizing risk, personal guarantee. A lot of you on this call may well have signed a personal guarantee when you first took over the practice, which again is quite reasonable. It's quite normal if you've come out of dental school or you've been associating and landlord has no history of credit history of your previous payments, etc. They want to have some sort of personal guarantee. What we don't want you to do is have a personal guarantee forever and ever. Amen. Right? If you've proved over a period of time that you are a good tenant and you've paid your rent, then that personal guarantee at some point in the future should be removed. So we want to maximize your flexibility. So what do we mean by that? Let's just say that there is an option in the adjacent space that becomes available. We want to have a right of first refusal. What we don't want is to be thinking, could really do with some more space, and then the next door becomes vacant and somebody else comes in, and it would have been a perfect opportunity for you to expand. So again, these things that we can add to a lease. And then we want to enhance your ability to eventually sell your practice. So I will touch on that a little bit later on in terms of a specific assignment provision clause. But overall, the well-structured, the better your lease is, the more obviously the more opportunity and the more chance you have to sell the practice, and the more value that it actually puts on the table. because anybody taking over a practice, and I speak to a lot of buyers as well who ask me, can you review this lease that I'm looking to take over this practice? And if there's a number of liabilities that they're going to be taking on themselves, the first thing they're going to do is going to drop the asking price if they're going to take on hundreds of thousands of liabilities when they take over that lease. So what are the main financial negotiables in your lease? As I sort of touched on before, there's really 7 main financial negotiables in your lease. There's base rent, which we talked about, annual increase, which we talked about, common area maintenance. This is your additional operating costs. Majority of leases nowadays will be triple net. So you will pay a base rent percentage plus your additional TMI, your tax, maintenance, and insurance. Now, the common area maintenance is the one that we look at the most, where we want to ensure that the language is, a little bit more tenant friendly, let's just say. I mean, landlords will do their best to pass on, as much, if not all, costs relating to the building to the tenant. But there is things that we can do to ensure that, you have a detailed itemized statement. You have the right to audit. So at least you know exactly what you're paying for. And we can also put some sort of, caps on the operating costs. So, if the landlord decides that they're going to make a big investment into the space, or they're going to redo the car park or the roof, you don't want to be hit with a massive, a massive one-off payment. We want to be able to maybe amortize that over a certain period of time. There's the fixturing period, free rent, tenant improvement, and landlord work. Now, these are more common when you're actually either starting a practice or building out a second practice. How long is that fixturing period? Is there any free rent involved whilst you're in possession, but you haven't had commencement of the practice? And is there any tenant improvement allowance? So we look at that from an analytical point of view. I mean, the sort of term free rent and tenant improvement allowance, in my experience, there's no such thing as free money. You're going to pay for it somewhere. So, our leasing and legal team, they will do a detailed analysis of, what that looks like. Even if we want the landlord to have some skin in the game and have some tenant improvement allowance, we need to work out financially, is that the best thing for us? I mean, if we're able to get finance at maybe a lower interest rate, although the interest rates have started to rise recently, we have to look at that, because if the landlord's giving you a massive tenant improvement allowance, then the likelihood is you're going to pay for that somewhere along the line. And then there's a landlord work, what's involved before you actually start the practice. So now, like I said, the financials is one key part of the lease agreement, but what tends to get overlooked is, as you can see, hundreds of thousands of hidden mistakes within your lease. And this is sort of 25 provisions in the lease that either get overlooked, or you just don't have the skilled specialized representative who negotiates dental specific leases and understands some of the liabilities and traps in the lease. So I'm not going to go through every single provision. I mean, we're going to touch on a couple to just give you an example, but there's the demolition and relocation clause. These can be quite common in certain leases. Clearly, they're a red flag. If there's a demolition clause hanging over your lease, then that's a problem. But there's certain things that we can do to, if not remove the demolition clause, for example, that we can either extend the notice period, or we can put a blackout period. So there's things that you can do to improve the language. It's not just black or white, right? So I wanted to just talk about a couple of examples So here we have what's called the option to renew provision. So this is found in 90% of leases. You sign a lease, you have a 5-year or 10-year lease, and you have some additional options. So I just give you a minute just to have a look over this this provision. And I'm going to just point out quite a few red flags just within this one provision. So as we can see here, where we've highlighted that it says, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain tenant, and if the tenant duly has regularly paid its rent, performed its covenants and obligations under the lease, and has not been in default. So the first thing here is the Dr. Joe Black, the letters are capital. What that means is that these options are personal to Dr. Joe Black. So essentially, this is just one of landlords' tips, and what they're saying is, you know, if you look to say, oh, I'm looking to sell my practice and I've got 12 years of term remaining, 2 years plus 2 5-year options, the landlord will say, well, hang on a minute, I gave those options to you. I didn't give them to somebody else who wants to take over your practice. So we want to try and ensure that the options are transferable, because it's just another way that the landlord can get control back and say, all right, well, if Dr. Smith wants to buy your practice, then, you know, and he wants some more term, then we're going to increase rents, etc. So the next thing you'll see, it says any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. So again, you can negotiate a good lease and make some great changes. You come to the renewal to exercise your option, and the landlord just puts in front of you the current standard form lease, which has inserted new clauses, new provisions, etc., that either you had struck out previously or that they wanted to, you know, add to the lease going forward. It says also, in no event shall it be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term. Now, this is quite common language, but again, common because what landlord wants to be paid less than he was paid in the previous year? But if we look back to, even if we look in just recently in the, you know, pandemic, and we go back to the recession, if the markets have changed and we've gone through a recession and etc., and your rent is at the high, and then it comes to renegotiating and rents have gone down dramatically, they're saying, well, basically, whatever happens, the rent won't be any less than you paid in the original term. And then the last thing it says is that, you know, if the landlord and tenant are unable to agree on the rent within sort of 60 days, then shall go to arbitration, but then it can be based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. So again, you could have an anchor tenant, you can have a Walmart, you could have a big tenant that's paying X amount. Like, how can you compare that with yourself? So again, I don't expect you to be experts tonight. I hope that I can certainly give you some valid information and tips and tricks, but this is just one provision in the lease, and there's 5 red flags, and this is in 90% of leases. Now, the cost of this mistake, having to relocate unexpectedly at the end of the term, if you miss your option, if you actually miss your option for whatever reason, if you have to absorb a significant increase of rent at the end of the term, and then you have the ability to not sell your practice because the options are not transferable, you're looking at anywhere between 200 to 500,000 liability just on that one provision. Now, this is an actual letter that one of our clients sent to us that was given to them by their landlord. Now, what happened here was landlord, again, another tip or trip to just ensure you know the critical dates within your lease agreement. if your lease is expiring and you have 6 months notice to exercise that option, please make sure you know exactly when those dates are, because landlord, you know, they're not going to, some may give you some notice, but others are not going to tell you that your lease is expiring. And, you know, if they can get you right close to the expiry and you miss your option deadline, then, you know, they know for a fact that you lose a lot of leverage. You know, you can see here that the landlord has said you were required to give 6 months notice to not later than 6 months if you wanted to renew your lease. And then the lovely landlord said, you know, I will be placing a for lease sign in a conspicuous but not intrusive place for the premises, and we'll start showing prospective tenants during business hours. So you've got people coming to look at your space, and that's going to pose a number of questions to, you know, your existing patients, etc. And the likelihood is the landlord puts something in front of you, you're going to sign it pretty much straight away, because you don't want to risk having no place to practice. Now, this is the assignment provision. Again, this is found in 75% of dental leases. Now, the assignment provision, essentially what that means is when it comes to transferring, selling your practice, normally in conjunction with the sale or acquisition of your practice, you have to get prior written consent from the landlord to transfer the lease. Now, I'll give you a little small amount of time just to have a quick look at this. I know it's quite wordy, and we will go through it. So the first thing it actually says here is that you should have received consent. You have to receive consent from the landlord. Now, this is quite common. No landlord is just going to let you transfer your lease to any sort of Tom, Dick, or Harry. They want to know who's taking over the space and who's coming in. So that's quite normal. Now, it does say that, you know, for such requests for consent, here the landlord gives 3 options. First option, to approve the tenant's request to assign the lease. The second option, simply just decline the request to assign the lease. And the third option, they actually can terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of such proposed lease assignment. So just for asking the landlord for permission, the landlord can terminate the lease. Now, this is what we describe as termination language. And again, 75% of dental office leases will have this language in the lease that prevents them from selling their practice. Just a little bit further down, it says, landlords shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of the current market rent for the lease premises, or 15% greater than the current rent. So essentially what it's saying here is landlord could give approval to assign the lease, but could increase the rents by 15%. Now, if your buyer is agreed a price on your practice and they've done their due diligence, etc., if they then find out that the rents that they're going to be paying are going to be 15% greater than what the current rent is, the first thing they're going to do is drop the asking price by 15%. It gets worse. So should the tenant receive from the assignee or subtenant any rental income, cash goods, any form of consideration in connection with the assignment of this lease or sublet premises, any consideration shall be paid directly within 30 days, paid to the landlord directly. So we describe this as proceeds of sale consideration language. So what they're saying is, and they know that a large transaction is going to take place, anything above the rental income. So let's say for argument's sake, like we said before, you're paying $5,000 a month, $60,000 a year. Let's say you sell your practice for $500,000. Landlord can actually ask for $440,000 just to assign the lease. Now, if you've worked and given a lot of years of your time and all the blood, sweat, and tears, now to me, and I'm very passionate about this, that the landlord shouldn't be entitled to any proceeds of sale. But again, I've seen it happen. I know it's happened. I actually had a client who was selling a practice for $2 million. Now, he had about 3 or 4 buyers that had fallen through for one reason or another. And he had this language in his lease. And he went to the landlord, and he found another buyer, and they were willing to pay $2 million. And he had language that allowed the landlord to 50% of the proceeds of sale, essentially $1 million. Now, in the end, this doctor, who was literally so desperate to sell his practice at this point and then fallen through so many times, he ended up cutting a check to the landlord for $263,000. Essentially said, I'm done, I'm out. I think he took his 7 million plus, and the landlord received $263,000 just to assign the lease. Now, the landlord's argument is, your building, my building, and has brought success that you've been practicing out, which to me is ridiculous and certainly not something that they should be entitled to. The final provision, again, this is just in one provision of the lease. There's 5 or 6 red flags. Now, let's say that we've got through the initial stage. We've managed to compel the landlord to assign the lease. What it says here is that, notwithstanding the landlord's consent to assignment, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of tenant or its assignees, subtenants, to observe each and every covenant of the lease. So this is what we call continuing liability. Now, best case scenario, you sell your practice, you ride off into the sunset, and you don't look back, and you're not liable for any future, tenant. Now, we had a client who sold his practice. He moved to Florida. He got a call from the landlord 3 years after the sale of his practice. Said, "Hi, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but your buyer, unfortunately, he took on too much debt and has gone bankrupt, and he's 3 months in arrears of the rent. He owes $20,000 plus 7 years remaining of the term, which you are now liable." Now, the last thing that this doctor wants to do is come out of retirement and start practicing dentistry again. So again, this is just one provision, 5 red flags just within this one provision. Cost of this mistake, again, inability to sell the practice, having to absorb a significant increase in rent if you're remaining liable as a guarantor beyond practice sale, and paying a portion of the sale proceeds. I mean, you name it, anywhere from $250,000 to $750,000 liability. We are going to have some questions as we go along, but I wanted to just touch on a couple of other slides, and we'll come back to the questions at the end. If you do have any questions, please feel free, put some in the question in the chat section, and we will touch on them a little bit after. So this slide, this is a slide I like to include in my presentations. This is something we actually got from the landlord's side, what we've called like a tenant lease cycle. So our recommendation is always to start the process, especially on a renewal, 24 months before the lease expires. Now, you may say, that seems like a long time. Well, why do we say that? Because what we just talked about, if there is a problem for whatever reason, it can take anywhere from sort of 12 to 18 months to find a space, build out a practice. If for whatever reason that was what actually occurred, and for whatever reason you're being pushed out, or you don't even want to stay in the space, but you need to know, you need to have the time. And some of the strategies, you may not even be thinking of moving, but if you start the conversation 2 years out, and one of the strategies that we use is, we're looking at other opportunities, at least it's realistic that that is a possibility. Now, the landlord, as I said before, so he wants to really get you into this sort of orange and red area. Very unlikely that he's going to tell you 2 years, a year before that the lease is expiring and what your plans are. Some will, but majority won't say anything. They want to get you into this orange and red zone, because they know once you get into this sort of orange, 8 months, 6 months prior, like we talked about before, if you miss an option, then they know that they've really, really got you. And the chances are, one, you don't have enough time to move. And two, you're going to sign something, you're going to pay a certain rental amount or whatever they're going to try and put in front of you, because you don't have time. And the last thing you want to do is be without a practice. So again, I don't want you to go home and look at the lease and phone up the landlord and say, what have I got in my lease? That's not what the purpose of tonight is. There is other ways of certainly doing that, and we'll talk about that later. But what I want you to know is, really understand the critical dates. Know that if you have a lease, when does it expire? I understand there's 50 pages of a lease agreement and legal documentation. It's not something that you're taking to bedtime reading, but just know the critical dates. Know when the lease expires. Know when there is an option deadline and what notice you have to give, because that's really important. So why is Cirrus, why have we been so successful in winning lease negotiations for over 25 years now? It's a question that I get asked a lot, and I'm proud to explain and talk through how we have really built up a niche business here and got a huge amount of success from negotiating the lease agreement. Now, a few things, as you can see here. So the first thing that we will do is gather all the documentation. So understand what your current sort of position is, what the lease says, like I say, understand all the critical dates. We will then spend some time to identify your, where you're at, what your sort of goals are, what stage you are in your dental career. Just started, are you in mid-career, or you're looking to transition? So we really want to kind of do a deep dive and understand exactly where you are, so we can align the lease agreement within your time period. So we would review the office lease for any liabilities, any areas of concern. While simultaneously, like I told you earlier, we pay for a lot of proprietary data. So we would do some market research. We'll look at the current rental rates in the area and the vacancy rates in the area, and see what else is available. We will then develop a treatment plan, a strategy for negotiation. Now, one of the things that we haven't done as of yet, we haven't even reached out, we haven't communicated, we haven't even spoken to the landlord. Like I said, the worst thing you can do is pick up the phone to the landlord tomorrow and say, have I got an assignment? Are you entitled to proceeds of sale? Do I have a demolition? That's not what we're trying to achieve. There is a strategy for our success. Like I said, these 5 things we do, so we will understand what type of landlord are we dealing with. Are we dealing with a big institutional landlord, a big REIT? Are we dealing with a small mum and pop? Have we done any work in that building before? What sort of personalities are we dealing with? So when we get on the phone, it's more of an education. You know, we understand that you have to work with these people, and you know, we're not trying to upset relations. Like I said, we don't go in guns blazing. We really try and educate them that, you know, this is a different type of business that you're dealing with, and you know, you're becoming the sort of anchor tenant now. You proved very recession proof during the pandemic, and you know, landlords are desperate or to have the healthcare, the dental tenant in their property, because you know, you have one of the lowest default rates in the country, and like I said, likelihood is you're going to stay there for a long time. So number 6, once we've developed a strategy, we will then, you know, start proposing the amendments or the lease proposal for negotiations. Now, the financial negotiations can take anywhere from sort of 15 to 20 hours on the back and forth. But from our experience, once we have agreed some of the financials, the landlord is much more motivated to make some of the legal changes to the lease. So, you know, we're remunerated directly by you, the client. We don't derive any commission. We don't work as a broker. We don't derive any commission from the landlord. You know, because from our perspective, there's a bit of a conflict of interest. So how can we represent you as best as possible if we're getting paid by the landlord? So, like I said, once we've negotiated the financials, then we spend at least 20 to 30 hours upwards on the legal provisions of the lease. And then we review the final executed lease just to make sure that everything's aligned. And then, yeah, that's the process, and that's what's given us success. So what we have here is what we call the critical dates and risk analysis. Essentially, it's a $2,000 value whereby we would spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease for any traps, liabilities, areas of concern. We would then get on a call to, like I said, just to understand a bit more about you and where you're at in your vision, and what the ideal lease look like for you, and how to negotiate, you know, effectively a tactical plan. Now, thanks to our sponsors and thanks to Henry Schein, as you'll see, there's another exit poll, which I would definitely suggest to fill that out. But just to continue, that complimentary lease review, because of Henry Schein and our business solution partners, everybody is entitled to a complimentary lease consultation. Now, it's extremely beneficial. It is on a first come, first served basis. So if you are interested, please fill out this poll. I would strongly recommend. It's a very beneficial hour that we would spend, really just taking a much more deeper dive on your lease and on your specific location. Like I said, we can pull demographic, we can pull reports on the current real estate metrics, just to see specifically what's happening in your location, because, you know, every location, every building is slightly different. You may be in a medical or office space, you may be in a retail plaza, so we can really take a deeper dive into your specific situation, and have a look at where your lease is, and any other sort of red flags that we've just talked about tonight that may be in the lease, and a treatment plan and a strategy moving forward. So I would ask you to fill out the exit poll, and like I said, if you are interested in the complimentary consult, please tick that exit poll, and I will be scheduling the complimentary lease consultations, like I said, on a first come, first served basis. If you want to slightly ahead of the game, then you need to send a copy of your existing lease agreement or amendment basically anything pertaining to the lease agreement, and you can send it to info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. You can send it to my own personal email address, which is Tessler, LTESSLER at cirrusconsultinggroup.com, and then we can go from there. Any questions? I have left some time back for some questions.
Thanks, Lee. Let's take a look to see if we have any questions so far.
Okay, hold on. So there's a question from Elizabeth Stade. Average range for cost of your service in renewing a lease. Difficult for me to really give an average. As I said, I would really, I'd like to see the lease, or your current lease, for example, and have a conversation and understand the scope of work, really, because it's hard for me to kind of just give a range without seeing your specific situation and what scope of work and what assistance you would potentially require from us. But I would strongly suggest you take up that consultation, and then we can discuss that in more detail. Any more questions? So another question is coming in saying, what sort of guarantees can you provide when it comes to negotiating or renegotiating a lease? I don't think there's a webinar that I've done without this question. So there's no guarantees. We don't have a crystal ball. But what we can guarantee, number one, that we've been doing this for a long time now, and just looking at, over 300 5-star Google reviews, looking at the strategies that we've just talked about in terms of how we go about speaking to the landlord, I can guarantee that if anyone is going to have any success, then it's going to be us, because it's not just about, we don't just take no for an answer. That's the first thing. Lots of times we have clients that I'll speak to and they'll say, oh, my landlord, and he never changes anything, he'll never do anything. And what we find is that it's essentially who's asking, how you're asking, what happens exactly if you say, I want to remove this clause, and the landlord says no. We don't just accept no. There is a number of step downs, like I said. In any negotiation, there's high, medium, low priority items. Now, you're going to have to concede on some, but you're going to fight tooth and nail on others. Now, where we've had success, and again, repeating ourselves, is once we explain to the landlord that we're not coming in, we're not trying to, take any commission or anything from you, right? We're essentially representing the doctor because they're just too busy chairside, and this is really not something that they specialize in. The likelihood is most of the big institutional landlords, they'll have their own representative, they'll have their own lawyer anyway. And once we get past that stage, and majority of the big landlords we've probably dealt with before anyway, and they know who we are, they know how we work, and they know what we're trying to achieve. And we're just trying to bring down bring the balance a little bit from a landlord favored structured lease to a little bit more of a tenant friendly, somewhere balanced, right? I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? Don't be shy. Okay, Corin, I think that may just conclude. I know we're a few minutes early.
All right. That means you just did such a great job with the presentation. You answered everyone's questions.
I tried my best. Hopefully everyone found it beneficial, and certainly appreciate, people taking the time out of their evening to join the presentation tonight. And if anyone's interested in that complimentary lease review, then please let us know, and we'll look forward to speaking to you in a little bit more detail.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lee, for the wonderful presentation this evening. It was truly insightful. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We did record tonight's webinar, and we'll email the recording out sometime in the next week. So if you want to refer back to any of the content, you certainly will be able to do so. And we also would appreciate your feedback via our survey that will pop up on your screen shortly after the webinar. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you on future webinars. And thank you again, Lee, for your time tonight.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much. Have a great night, everybody.
Have a great night, everyone.